Huh? Um, Turn it off and on again. We'll see. All right, we're gonna try the old tried and true turn it off and on again. But while we're getting ready to see if that works right, I want to give you a couple heads up. So our exam is coming up on February 10th. So that's next Monday. So I put up a practice exam for you all to try working through. This is not looking great. Okay, let's tighten cables. My estimate of where we will get to by the end of Friday. So anything that we get to, is fair game unless I tell you otherwise. But probably we'll be leaving some of that blood packet until our next exam. I don't expect we will get to clotting. Is this even worse? Possible. Okay, we'll talk through it. I'll rewrite anything. Hopefully it'll catch up with us. Okay. So we're going to keep talking about mean arterial pressure and how we regulate it. Okay. Oh, geez, that's really bad. Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna go see if anybody on the hallway knows how to fix this issue. If not, we may be doing a chalk test. All right. Hopefully IT will be on their way to fix this at some point soon. I'll post a video that goes for sure with the slides so that you can get all the red text later, but we will talk through some of these concepts right now. So your notes can mirror my notes. I'm gonna click through so it should go in order with the slides anyway. Okay. So when we left off, we were talking about mean arterial pressure. All right. I have to draw real big here. Let's zoom this. Crazy. Whoa. Okay. So we're talking about mean arterial pressure, which we know is our main force powering blood through the cardiovascular system, right? So we know that we're thinking about blood flow through the system equivalent to a difference in pressure divided by our resistance. And last time we reshaped this equation so that we were able to isolate mean arterial pressure specifically. So we looked at the fact that we're talking about cardiac output as our flow, mean arterial pressure as our main pressure difference, and then total peripheral resistance as our resistance for the system. So when we multiply across, we have total peripheral resistance times cardiac output, which we know requires both stroke volume and heart rate, giving us our mean arterial pressure. So when we talk about regulation of mean arterial pressure, we're talking about regulation of any of these factors, or usually regulation of all of them combined. Okay, so the reason we need to do this is blood flow is important, right? And having the right amount of blood flow is important. So we want to have a mean arterial pressure that's within a normal range. That's why you have a range that they're comparing to when you go to the doctor's office, making sure your blood pressure isn't too high and isn't too low. Okay, so it's critical normal function. So we have two types of problems we may see, right? So if we have a mean arterial pressure that's too low, right? So one that's lower than our normal, okay. We have a lower than our normal situation. We've got hypotension. So hypo is too low. That's our Greek root. Tension, we're thinking blood pressure. So hypotension, blood flow is going to be coming through with too low a pressure. If we think about the fact that this equation overall is a relationship, right? If we have a change to our mean arterial pressure, we may see that kind of feed back to either our cardiac output or maybe a little bit to our resistance, right? But we want to have adequate blood flow to tissues, so too low is bad. And this is kind of an emergency, right? If you have too low a pressure, this is going to mean that you don't have adequate oxygenation to all your different organ systems. You don't have adequate removal of waste products. So this is critical immediately. But we also have a problem if our blood pressure is too high. That's the one we think about more often, even though it's not quite so immediately deathly, right? So mean arterial pressure that's higher than normal, the problem. So this is hypertension, so hyper for too much. Tension, again, for this pressure we're looking at. Okay. And this is a problem because this is creating damage kind of long term. If you have blood pressure coming in too high a force through all those little arterioles and capillary beds in any given organ, that puts kind of long-term stress on an organ and an organ system. And particularly, it's putting long-term stress on your heart. Right. So stressful for your heart. And we're putting long-term stress on blood vessels. So blood vessels in any part of your body, in any organ system. So stress on blood vessels. Okay. So this isn't going to be an immediate heart attack type problem when we're talking about stress on the heart. We're talking about it's having to work too hard long term. But when we think about aging and diseases people kind of pick up over the course of their life, right? This is going to start to become more problematic as you get older, as you start to see the effects of this long-term hypertension, this long-term excess of pressure in the tissues. Okay. So in this unit, we're mainly going to be thinking about regulation in the short term. And when we say short term, right, so at the beginning of this semester, we looked at that video of the man with the specific type, the neurogenic orthostatic hypotension, right? And how he was falling, he was tripping because of drops in blood pressure, which actually related to damage to the nervous system, right? So we're going to be thinking right now mainly about short-term regulation. When we say short-term regulation, we're talking minutes, seconds, that kind of order, right? So short-term regulation. Okay, couple minutes maybe. We're going to think about regulating our cardiac output and our TPR, right? Okay. Have tech issues with a pencil, right? We're going to be regulating our cardiac output and TPR so that we can regulate our mean arterial pressure. Reminder, mean arterial pressure is our cardiac output times our TPR. Okay. Which means that we're going to be using heart and blood vessels to do this. And mostly we're going to be thinking about nerves here. So this is primarily under neural control. Now this is different than if we were talking about long-term regulation, right? So with long-term regulation, we're going to need to think about changes to blood volume, okay? So with long-term regulation, this is minutes to days. We're going to need the kidneys to change the amount of blood volume we're keeping stored in our system. We know at least 60% of it or so is in those veins, in that volume reservoir with that high compliance. So long term, if we change the amount of blood, we can also change the blood pressure. And this is mainly going to be under the control of hormones. So next, we are going to be thinking about that neural piece. Let's try this. Okay, so neural control. Okay. So one of the things we're going to be thinking about with neural control is that pressure, blood pressure, mean arterial pressure is something that is a regulated variable when we think about homeostasis, which means we're going to have all those steps that we talked about way at the beginning of A&P1 involved in homeostasis in one of those regulation kind of loops. So we're going to need a detector or a sensor. We're going to need a nerve going to an integration center. We're going to have more nerves going out. Okay. These would be our controllers. And we're going to need to go to effector organs that have an effect on that factor that we're detecting. Okay. So for our purposes here, when we're thinking about neural control of blood pressure, of mean arterial pressure, our detectors are going to be called baroreceptors. So baro means pressure. This is actually all one word, baroreceptors, pressure sensors, okay? We're going to have sensory nerves going back to our integration center. Our integration center here are going to be cardiovascular centers in the brainstem. So actually a part of the brainstem that you saw before, because you saw the whole brainstem. So in the medulla oblongata, we have these specific sites where we control things related to the heart and vasculature. Okay. So we're going to have brainstem here. Remember, integration centers usually are somewhere in the central nervous system. Our controller here is going to be the autonomic nervous system. So our way out is through sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Mainly, as we've seen, we've been talking in this unit about the sympathetics over and over again. We haven't really talked about parasympathetics. So when we think about effects on the vasculature, that's really going to be mostly under the sympathetic control side. But we have to keep in mind the parasympathetics because we know we're looking at cardiac output as one of the factors that affects mean arterial pressure. And we know that parasympathetics do have an effect on the heart. Specifically, they can slow down heart rate, right? So the autonomic nerves as a whole are involved here, even though we're focusing mostly on sympathetics. Okay. So our effector organs here are our heart and our blood vessels. Okay. So when we think about what types of baroreceptors we have, we're going to be thinking about kind of two types. We're going to start with our pressure receptors that sense that pressure in the first place. So our baroreceptors that act as pressure receptors are going to be located in the aortic arch and in an area called the carotid sinus, right before we have our internal and external carotid arteries split. The way they work is they sense a stretch, right? So they're embedded in the wall of an artery. They sense stretch, and that stretch means that the vessel is under more pressure, right? So they're going to go kind of haywire. They're going to change how frequently they're signaling up to the brain stem, so signaling up to the medulla oblongata, and they are going to be our detector telling us that we need to have a response here. Okay. So you will see these locations in lab, right? But if we're thinking heart, I'll draw a more anatomically accurate one than usual. Okay, so vena cava are our veins. We have a superior and inferior coming back to a right atrium. All right. When you look at the heart will have an apex that's kind of pointy, pointing this way. Our right atrium is approximately here. Our left atrium is approximately here. And here, most of what we're seeing is left ventricle, but we'll see a little bit of right ventricle kind of peeking through. I wouldn't expect you to be able to draw this. The reason I'm drawing it is I want to show you that aortic arch. All right, so the aortic arch is coming up and it curves, right? So where it curves, we have 3 blood vessels coming off, like this. Okay. And then we will have splits of these blood vessels later on. I'm just going to draw this one because this middle one was our left common carotid. And now I'm drawing how you'd see kind of a split up here. The reason I'm drawing that is that the carotid sinus is this area right below that split. So kind of that fork, you'd see a little bit of a swelling. A sinus means a space. So we have one arterial baroreceptor there. And we have another one in the arch itself. Okay. So the reason we have them in these two places is our carotids. Our internal carotid is going right up to the brain, right? We saw it come into the circle of Willis and supply all that blood flow to the brain. So it's super important for your body to be able to tell, okay, do we have enough pressure to get to the brain, right? The other side of that, your aorta is pulling blood into the rest of your systemic circuit, so the rest of your body. So having a pressure sensor there in the aortic arch means that you are able to sense that you have enough pressure going out to all the different organ systems. Okay. So they're signaling up to the medulla oblongata, which remember the brainstem has kind of top piece, the midbrain that we mostly don't see, that big egg-shaped pons, and then a slight swelling for the medulla oblongata below it as we go to the rest of our spinal cord. So our cardiovascular control centers are here. So that is our integration center for our blood pressure regulation. So when we think about how that cardiovascular center, or those collected cardiovascular centers, the medulla oblongata, help us out, help us control mean arterial pressure. First, let's think about regulation of the heart, right? So before, when we thought about the heart, right, we know that we are going to be affecting both our stroke volume and our heart rate when we change autonomics to the heart. And I'm just going to write the TPR in there because it comes into play in the rest of our MAP regulation. Okay. So when we are thinking about the relationship between the medulla oblongata and the heart, we have an important part. So parasympathetics have to come from either cranial nerves or some limited number come from the sacral region, right? They're craniosacral in origin. We have parasympathetics, that rest and digest part, coming from nerves that are basically at the top and bottom of your body. Okay. So we've seen the vagus nerve coming off the side here, basically, right? So you saw a bundle of threads probably as cranial nerve 10. Okay. And they head over to the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. And we have some branches to the AV node, that atrioventricular node as well. Okay. So here we have parasympathetics. Okay. So that's going to our SA node. And our AV node. And this decreases heart rate, this rest and digest portion. So primarily through that influence on the SA node, but we can group those together for this single effect here. Okay. Oh, and I can see I have some red text here. So overall, the title of this slide, if you're following along, was autonomic output to cardiovascular effectors. Okay. So we also have sympathetic input. Now, we want to recall sympathetic input doesn't come from the brainstem. It's not craniosacral in origin. It's thoracolumbar. So from nerves coming out of the thorax and the first two lumbar vertebrae. You'll actually see the sympathetic trunk in lab, which is where we have those sympathetic nerves kind of mixing together and then spreading out through the body. Okay. So we're down a little farther, we're in the thorax, but we have a structure that looks kind of like beads on the chain called the sympathetic trunk. And that's where our sympathetic nerves come from. Okay, so this is our sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk, sympathetic chain means the same thing. Okay, so you see it written the other way. Okay, so we can still affect heart rate with our sympathetic innervation, so that fight or flight part of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, because likewise, we have some nerves that go to the sinoatrial node. We have some nerves to the AV node, okay? Okay. Now, when we communicate between the sympathetic trunk and these sympathetic nerves to these parts of the electroconductive system, we're going to be raising heart rate. So we've got an opposite direction here with this fight or flight part. So heart rate would go up with those two connections. Okay. But the sympathetics aren't done yet. Okay. The sympathetics also, let's imagine, say like, here's the wall between right and left. We'll peel off the left atrium over there. Okay. Not the most accurate part, but what I want to point out to you, right, is that we also have nerves to the ventricles here. So we have nerves to the ventricular myocardium, okay? And this means that we can also affect stroke volume, right? Okay. So innervation to the ventricles. When we increase contractility, means we increase stroke volume. So we squeeze harder, we increase stroke volume, okay? And now our next two things that we think about with the sympathetics don't have to do with the heart. So this is all the effects on cardiac output that we talked about in chapter 13 at the end of A&P 1. So you can see that parasympathetic innervation, because it decreases heart rate, would tend to decrease mean arterial pressure. Sympathetics, increasing heart rate and or increasing stroke volume, are increasing mean arterial pressure. We have two other ways that they do that. So we have the effect on the arterioles. And we have the effect on the veins. Okay. And we know that for both of these, one of the big things that we're thinking about is the fact that the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system gives off norepinephrine. Norepinephrine binds to alpha receptors, both in those arterioles and the veins. In the arterioles, our big effect was an increase in TPR when we activate those alpha receptors that are throughout most of the body. Draw an up arrow. So increase in TPR. So you'll notice all of the effects of the sympathetics go together, right? We don't have it sometimes raising, sometimes lowering mean arterial pressure. Everything stays the same direction. Okay. And for the veins, we're thinking increases in venomotor tone. Which produced increases in venous return to the heart, which then looped back and affected really that stroke volume again, right? So kind of increasing how much we're squeezing out. Okay. So all of these pieces of the autonomic nervous system come back to one or more of these three factors that together are all we need to determine our mean arterial pressure. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is something called the baroreceptor reflex. Make sure that is what we're talking about. Yep. Okay. So what the baroreceptor reflex is a reflex, right? That's in there in the word, right? So it's a reflex. And when we say it's a reflex, it has to be a reflex to something, right? So a reaction to something. So our baroreceptor reflex is a reaction to a drop in blood flow, or sorry, a drop in blood pressure. So I'm just going to put that on here. So it's a reaction to a drop in mean arterial pressure. Okay. So we'll walk through a flow chart of how we can think about that. Okay. So our first thing that's going to happen if we take a look at what is ultimately going to be a negative feedback loop, right? The reflex is we want to reverse this change. All right, we're going to have to start with our change itself. Right, so we're starting with the thing we're trying to fix, which is our drop in mean arterial pressure. Okay, so now we got to sense that, right? So we have arterial baroreceptors, those pressure receptors. And they are going to change how they signal to our central nervous system, okay? So they're actually decreasing frequency of the action potentials to the central nervous system. But what we really care about understanding here, right, is that this is our signal that blood pressure dropped. Okay. So that's our next thing that happened. Okay. So now we're going to have a couple pieces that we're going to need to pull together if we're thinking about what's happening in the cardiovascular control centers. Right, by which we now know that's mostly the medulla oblongata. So we're going to send directly signals to the parasympathetics. Okay. And we are also going to send signals to the sympathetics, but that's going to be a bit of a longer route. We don't have a nerve directly from the medulla oblongata to the heart, right? Because otherwise that wouldn't be a sympathetic nerve. So it communicates down the spinal cord and then out through the sympathetic trunk. But ultimately, the idea for what we need to do is coming from the brainstem. Now let's trace the parasympathetic part first. All right, so we are going to dial down the activity of the parasympathetics, right? Because our goal is to raise the mean arterial pressure back up. Parasympathetics, where the rest and digest, they keep your heart rate slow, right? So we want to speed it up because we want to increase that pressure. So we can do that by easing off those parasympathetics that project to our SA node. Yeah, okay. Okay, so here we're going to tell that SA node, we actually want you to fire your action potentials more often. Action potential frequency goes up. The action potential frequency means like the firing rate, right? So if the firing rate at the SA node is going up, that means our heart rate's going up. So when we decrease parasympathetics, action potential in the SA node goes up, and this increases our heart rate. All right, so this is already one way that we are getting towards that change to our mean arterial pressure, because this is one of our main factors that we're tracing, right? We're tracing heart rate, we're tracing stroke volume, and we're tracing total peripheral resistance. So let's go over to the sympathetic side. Okay. We're going to have more things happening here. That's pretty much it for what the parasympathetics are doing. Okay, so we're going to increase sympathetic activity, as the parasympathetics and sympathetics are always both active at some amount. Sympathetics, though, are fight or flight. We're going to have a lot more to do here. They're always kind of in the opposite direction than the parasympathetics. Right, so we got our sympathetics, and they're going to have multiple things they can control, right? So one, so they're also going to that SA node, right? And a decrease in parasympathetics raises heart rate by increasing frequency in the SA node. A rise in sympathetic activity does the same thing, right? So we're working together here. We're turning off our parasympathetics a little, we're turning up our sympathetics. All of that has this effect of raising our heart rate. So now we want to think about things that the sympathetics do that the parasympathetics can't, all right? So if we're thinking about heart, we're going to be thinking about that myocardium, right? So ventricles. Okay. We're going to up the contractility. So we're upping the force with which they're contracting. Okay. Which means we've increased stroke volume. Right. So we increase stroke volume. So this is another way we are turning off that drop at the top in mean arterial pressure. Okay. We can also affect veins and arterioles. Okay. So we got veins. We know from last time that our sympathetics increase venomotor tone. When we increase venomotor tone, what that is doing is we're decreasing how compliant the walls of those vessels are. Remember, high compliance equals floppy, not much pressure buildup, even when you put volume in. When we have lowered compliance, which is what venomotor tone is, that's like a certain amount of contraction there. So that drop in compliance, so rise in venomotor tone, drop in compliance. With this kind of stiffer vessel, we now have an increase in pressure in the veins, so an increase in venous pressure. Still takes us a little while to get to the ultimate effect, right? But this is still happening in the veins. But now we're thinking about the effect actually on the heart. The thing that's happening in the heart is as we increase that venous pressure, we increase venous return, which means we increase end diastolic volume, AKA how much the heart has filled at the end of diastole, at the end of this relaxed phase, right? This happens to have the effect of putting the muscle fibers of the heart more towards their optimal length. So when we squeeze, we had more blood in there, and we're squeezing a bit harder. So overall, this is an effect on stroke volume. Finally, we have our arterioles. I can give myself a lot of space, which is okay because for our arterioles, we're going to vasoconstrict. And we're going to raise total peripheral resistance pretty directly because that vasoconstriction is decreasing the radius. A smaller radius means we have a greater resistance. Okay, so you can see we have raised each of the factors that control mean arterial pressure. Heart rate and stroke volume together are cardiac output. Total peripheral resistance is our resistance. So all of this together, pulling it together, now our mean arterial pressure goes back up. Okay. So we have now done what we set out to achieve. Oops, sorry. We have now done what we set out to achieve with this reflex. We've put our blood pressure back to normal, brought that mean arterial pressure back up. And this is what has to happen every time you kind of stand up from sitting for a long time. That immediate reflex has to happen because gravity is kind of pulling your blood down, right? We talked about that idea a little bit as we talked about the veins and why they need those valves in them, right? So every time you stand up, you might experience a slight drop in blood pressure, but you hopefully don't even notice it because this reflex happens automatically, pulling it back up, making sure you have adequate pressure and flow to the brain and to the rest of your body. Okay. So this is a negative feedback loop because we affected the opposite change. Okay. All right. Some yeah, we'll just mention them real quick. Okay, so for long-term regulation, that's not involved in our baroreceptor reflex. The baroreceptor reflex is for these short changes, right? We said short changes, short regulation is neural. So for long-term, we mentioned we need kidneys. The official word for that is renal. So long-term regulation is occurring through renal regulation, actually of the blood volume, the amount of blood. So that's on this next slide that's not up, but that's a repeat of what we've heard already. So we'll pick up next time briefly mentioning hormonal control before we start to talk about some factors about the blood itself.